When we think of France, we often think of liberty, equality, fraternity. But for French women, that journey to political equality, well, it was surprisingly long and really, really complicated. It's a story that shows us that winning the right to vote, that's often just the beginning of the fight.
For the first time, I existed. Just let that sink in. This is how one French woman described casting her very first ballot back in 1945. It's such a powerful reminder that this wasn't just about politics. For millions of people, it was about finally being seen as a full citizen.
But here's the thing, this victory was also profoundly late. And that brings up a really big question. In the very nation that championed the rights of man, why on earth did women have to wait so long for their own? To put this into perspective, let's look at the timeline. New Zealand granted women the vote way back in 1893. The UK and the US, they followed after World War I. But France, this supposed beacon of liberty, didn't get around to it until 1944. We're talking a massive gap of over 50 years. It's kind of stunning when you see it laid out like that.
So the law itself was actually signed by General de Gaulle in 1944, while the war was still raging. But the first real chance for women to use this brand new right, that came a year later, in the municipal elections of April 1945, as France was trying to rebuild itself from all that conflict.
All right, so the vote was won. Great. But as it turns out, that was just the first hurdle. The decades that followed weren't some story of rapid progress. Nope, it was a period of deep, frustrating stagnation.
In that very first election year, 1945, women made up just 5% of the deputies in the National Assembly. Okay, a small start, but it's a start, right? You'd expect that number to climb pretty steadily over the years. Well, get this, by 1996, 50 years later, that number had barely moved. It was just 6%. Think about that for a second. Half a century of voting rights resulted in a measly 1% increase in representation. It's pretty wild. And if you look at it on a global scale, the problem was even more stark. By the late 90s, France's 11% female representation was way behind, not just places like Sweden, but even nations like Mozambique and Vietnam. The political establishment was just stuck. One observer even called it condescending indifference. So France realized that just waiting around for change, that wasn't going to work. The system needed a shock. And that shock came in the form of a radical and pretty controversial idea, a law that would actually force gender parity. Now, this didn't just happen overnight. The whole push really kicked off in 1996 with this powerful manifesto from 10 women politicians. And they were from both the left and the right, which is key. This built up momentum, and it led to a prime minister's promise, a constitutional amendment, and then finally the groundbreaking parity law in the year 2000. But boy, was this divisive. Supporters argued it was the only way to finally force change and make parties go out and actively recruit women. But the opponents, and this included some prominent feminists, they argued it was an insult, that it suggested women couldn't win on merit alone. And they felt it undermined this core French ideal of universalism, where a citizen is just a citizen, not defined by their gender. So the law passed, but did it actually work? Well, the results have been a mixed bag. A huge leap forward in some ways, but with these stubborn cultural hurdles that just won't go away. I mean, on paper, the success was undeniable. Before the law, back in 97, women held just 11% of the seats. By 2023, that number had jumped all the way to 36%. Statistically, you have to say, the law worked. But a law can't change a culture overnight. A government survey found that a shocking 74% of elected women have faced sexism or sexual violence, and most of the time, it's from their male colleagues. And the inequalities go beyond the workplace, too. Women still do 80% of the domestic work at home, which creates a huge practical barrier to taking on a demanding political job. And then there's this other hurdle, visibility. Even with more women in office, their voices just aren't being heard as often. They get only 26% of the political airtime on French broadcasts. So clearly, having more seats in parliament hasn't translated to an equal share of the microphone. And all this really brings us to a crucial point. The French experience, it isn't some isolated story. It's basically a case study for a global, ongoing struggle for real political equality, where rights, even once you've won them, are not always secure. One way we can actually measure this is with something called the Women's Power Index. It's put together by the Council on Foreign Relations, and it gives us a snapshot of female political leadership all around the globe.
And honestly, that snapshot is pretty sobering. Out of 193 nations, just 25 currently have a woman as their head of state or government. It's just a stark reminder that even with decades of progress, the very highest levels of power, they remain overwhelmingly male. And here's the really crucial part. These rights are fragile. In Afghanistan, women who first got the vote way back in 1919 have now had that right completely stripped away. And even in the United States, proposed laws could potentially disenfranchise millions of women whose married names don't match their birth certificates. Progress is absolutely not guaranteed. Which leaves us with a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it? From France to the rest of the world, it is so clear that winning the vote was only step one. The real challenge, the one we are still grappling with today, is figuring out what exactly is step two.